My 7-year-old son was left at the airport while my wife and her entire family flew to Disney. In the family group chat, the message read, "Come get him. We're boarding now." My wife's mother added coldly, "Don't make US feel guilty. He needs to learn airport lesson." I didn't reply. I just ran to the terrified. As soon as they landed, their world. Look, I'm not saying I'm psychic or anything, but I've always had this gut feeling that Mondays were specifically designed by some sadistic cosmic entity who really hated humanity. You know the type of morning I'm talking about. The alarm clock sounds like a fire alarm had a baby with a car horn. Your coffee tastes like disappointment filtered through regret, and your inbox is already screaming at you about deliverables that were apparently due yesterday. That particular Monday started exactly like that, except with the added bonus of my boss Gerald breathing down my neck about some PowerPoint presentation that absolutely nobody was going to read. Gerald's the kind of guy who says things like, "Let's circle back on that," and "We need to leverage our synergies," without a trace of irony, like he genuinely believes corporate jargon is a real language spoken by real humans. I was sitting at my desk, staring at a spreadsheet that might as well have been written in ancient hieroglyphics, nursing my third cup of coffee that tasted like it had been brewed in a gym sock, when my phone buzzed. Now, normally I ignore my phone during work hours because nothing good ever comes from family group chats at 9:30 on a Monday morning. It's usually my mother-in-law Margaret sharing some Facebook meme about how back in her day, kids respected their elders, or my sister-in-law Diane posting 17 pictures of her perfect children doing perfect things in their perfect matching outfits. But something made me look at this one. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the universe finally deciding to give me a heads up before dropping a nuclear bomb on my life. The message read, "Come get him. We're boarding now." I stared at those 6 words like they were written in a foreign language. Come get him? Get who? My brain scrambled to make sense of it. They were supposed to be at Disney World with Noah, my 7-year-old son, having the time of their lives riding Space Mountain and eating overpriced churros. This had to be a joke, right? Maybe Noah had accidentally spilled his orange juice all over Grandma Margaret's designer Hermes scarf, the one she wore to literally every family function and wouldn't shut up about, because apparently it cost more than my car payment. Or maybe he'd thrown a typical kid tantrum because he wanted to go on Splash Mountain for the 15th time and Margaret, being the delicate flower she pretends to be, couldn't handle a child acting like an actual child. But then I saw the 3 dots indicating someone else was typing, and my stomach dropped faster than the Tower of Terror. Lydia's mother, yes, the same Margaret I just mentioned, sent another message that made my blood run colder than a Minnesota winter. Don't make us feel guilty. He needs to learn a lesson. Learn a lesson? What kind of lesson requires abandoning a 7-year-old at an airport? Advanced survival skills? How to negotiate with TSA agents? The fundamentals of childhood trauma? My hands started shaking, and not from the caffeine overdose I'd been cultivating all morning. I read the messages again, hoping maybe I'd misunderstood, that there was some reasonable explanation that didn't involve my in-laws being the actual worst people on the planet. But nope, the words stayed the same, glaring at me from my phone screen like an indictment of every decision I'd ever made in my entire life, particularly the decision to marry into this family. I didn't reply, couldn't reply. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but what was I supposed to say? Thanks for the heads up that you've committed child abandonment. Cool, just casually leaving my kid at the airport, totally normal behavior. Instead, I just stood up so fast my chair rolled backward and crashed into the cubicle wall behind me. My coworker Janet looked up from her computer with the expression of someone who'd just witnessed a man having a complete mental breakdown in real time. "Ryan, you okay?" she asked, but I was already grabbing my keys, my wallet, my phone, and whatever shred of sanity I had left. Gerald appeared out of nowhere like a corporate vampire sensing distress. Whoa, where are you going? We have the quarterly synergy meeting in 20 minutes, and I really need you to walk the team through those optimization metrics we discussed. But I was already halfway to the door, practically running through the office like I was auditioning for an action movie. Behind me, I could hear Gerald sputtering something about team dynamics and professional commitment. But honestly, he could take his synergy and shove it where the sun doesn't leverage its potential. The parking lot became a blur of asphalt and panic. My hands fumbled with my car keys. When did they make car keys so complicated? and I finally managed to unlock the door and throw myself into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of that parking lot like I was in the opening scene of a Fast and Furious movie, except instead of Vin Diesel's cool confidence, I had the frantic energy of a dad who just realized his family was clinically insane. The drive to the airport was something out of a fever dream. Traffic lights became suggestions. Speed limits became gentle recommendations. One hand gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white, while the other frantically Googled things like, how long can a child survive alone in an airport? And is abandoning a child at an airport illegal? And how to disown your entire in-law family legally. My phone kept buzzing with more messages. Probably Margaret and Lydia trying to justify their actions with some twisted logic about teaching independence or building character. But I ignored every single one. The airport couldn't come fast enough. Every red light felt like an eternity. Every slow driver felt like a personal attack. I may have shouted some things at other motorists that I'm not particularly proud of, but desperate times call for desperate vocabulary. When I finally screeched into the airport parking garage, I didn't even bother looking for a proper spot. I just abandoned my car in the first available space. Ironically, abandoning my vehicle felt weirdly appropriate given the circumstances, and sprinted toward the terminal entrance. Security looked at me like I was either a threat or having a medical emergency. Maybe both. I probably looked like a lunatic, wild-eyed and panting, asking every airport employee I could find about a 7-year-old boy with a Captain America backpack. And then I saw him. Noah was sitting on a bench between two police officers, Officer Daniels, whose name tag I caught as I got closer, and another officer whose stern expression suggested this wasn't her first rodeo dealing with terrible family situations. My son looked so small sitting there, clutching his Captain America backpack like it was the only solid thing left in his entire world. His face was red and blotchy from crying, his eyes swollen, his little shoulders hunched in a way that made him look like he was trying to disappear into himself. That image, that single moment, hit me harder than any punch I'd ever taken. Harder than any bad news I'd ever received, harder than the realization that the people I'd trusted with my child had just thrown him away like he was nothing. Daddy, Noah's voice cracked as he saw me, and he launched himself off that bench and into my arms with the force of every emotion a 7-year-old could possibly contain. I caught him, held him, felt his little body shaking against mine, and in that moment, one crystal-clear thought echoed through my mind, louder than anything else. They just left him. They actually just left him here. My in-laws, my wife's family, the people who claimed to love him, had abandoned my son at an airport like he was a piece of luggage they didn't want to pay the fee for. And that's when I knew everything was about to change. Here's the thing about red flags. When you're wearing rose-colored glasses, they just look like flags. Regular, normal, everyday flags waving in the breeze of what you convince yourself is a perfectly functional family dynamic. That's the Whitmore family experience in a nutshell. At the center of this circus was Margaret, my mother-in-law, a woman who could make the Wicked Witch of the West look like Mary Poppins. Margaret was one of those people who wielded the phrase, "I'm just being honest," like a weapon, as if brutal cruelty somehow became acceptable when you slapped a disclaimer on it. She had this whole philosophy about child rearing that she loved to share at every possible opportunity, usually right after Noah did something that displeased her, which was basically existing in her presence. Children should be raised with resilience, she'd say, sipping her wine like she was dispensing ancient wisdom instead of justification for emotional neglect. Translation: ignore kids until they stop crying. Don't validate their feelings, and make sure they understand that love is conditional based on how well they perform in the family hierarchy. And speaking of hierarchy, let's talk about Diane, Lydia's older sister and Margaret's obvious favorite child. Diane had somehow managed to produce 2 children, Chloe and Brandon, who Margaret treated like they'd been personally delivered by angels riding unicorns. These kids could literally do no wrong in Grandma's eyes. I'm not exaggerating when I say I once watched Brandon, who was 9 at the time, deliberately knock over an entire pitcher of sweet tea at a family barbecue, soaking the tablecloth and everyone's food, and Margaret just laughed it off with a "boys will be boys." Such spirit. Meanwhile, Noah once accidentally bumped into a side table and knocked over an empty glass. Didn't break it, just knocked it over. and Margaret spent the next 20 minutes lecturing him about spatial awareness and being more careful in other people's homes. Christmas at the Whitmore house was less Winter Wonderland and more Hunger Games with tinsel. Every year, I'd watch this rigged competition play out like some twisted reality show. Diane's kids would open present after present. iPads, gaming consoles, designer clothes, those expensive sneakers that cost more than my first car, remote control drones that probably required a pilot's license. The pile of gifts around them would grow so tall you could barely see the kids behind it. They'd squeal with delight, and Margaret and Lydia's father Robert, a man so passive he made beige paint look exciting, would beam with pride like they'd personally discovered the cure for childhood disappointment. Then Noah would open his gifts. Last Christmas, I'll never forget, he unwrapped a sweater that looked like it had been in a fistfight with a thrift store clearance rack and lost. It was this hideous brown color that I didn't even know existed in nature, with a pattern that could only be described as what if sadness was a textile design. The tag was still on it, $15 from some discount outlet store that probably also sold expired canned goods and questionable electronics. Noah, being the sweet kid he is, smiled and said, "Thank you, Grandma," because we'd taught him manners, unlike some people. But I saw his face fall for just a second, saw him glance over at his cousins drowning in their mountain of expensive toys, and something in my chest just cracked. I tried talking to Lydia about it once, after a particularly brutal family gathering where Noah had been ignored for 3 straight hours while everyone fawned over Brandon's science fair project. We were driving home. Noah had fallen asleep in the back seat, and I figured it was the perfect time to address the elephant that had been sitting in our marriage for years. "Honey," I said, choosing my words carefully because I'd learned that criticizing the Whitmore family was like walking through a minefield blindfolded. "Do you notice that your mom seems to, I don't know, favor Diane's kids over Noah?" Lydia didn't even look up from her phone. "Oh my God, Ryan, stop being so dramatic," she said with that dismissive tone that made me feel like I was the crazy one for having eyes and basic observational skills. "They're just better behaved than Noah. Maybe if he wasn't so quiet and antisocial all the time, Mom would warm up to him more." Better behaved. That phrase rattled around in my head for days. Better behaved than what, exactly? Noah was a dream kid, polite, thoughtful, creative, curious about the world. Sure, he was quiet, but that's because he was an introvert who liked reading books and drawing pictures instead of demanding constant attention. But in the Whitmore family worldview, better behaved apparently meant louder, more aggressive, and biologically related to Diane. The double standards were absolutely insane. When Diane's daughter Chloe threw a full-blown tantrum at a restaurant because they didn't have the specific type of chicken nuggets she wanted. I'm talking screaming, throwing silverware, the whole performance. Margaret just smiled indulgently and said, "She knows what she likes." Such a strong personality. But when Noah once politely declined to eat green beans because he didn't like the texture, Margaret launched into a 15-minute lecture about gratitude and children in Africa who would be grateful for those beans, and your generation being too entitled. The irony of lecturing a 7-year-old about entitlement while her other grandchildren had more electronics than a Best Buy store was apparently lost on her. Every family dinner became a subtle exercise in making Noah feel less than. Margaret would ask Chloe and Brandon about their activities, their friends, their interests, spending ages engaged with their stories and accomplishments. "Brandon, tell everyone about your soccer goal." "Chloe, show Grandma that dance you learned." Then she'd turn to Noah with this expression like she'd just remembered he existed and say, "And Noah, are you still reading those comic books?" The way she said comic books made it sound like a communicable disease. My buddy Jake from work, who I'd occasionally vent to over beers, once asked me why I put up with it. "Dude, your in-laws sound like villains from a Lifetime movie," he said, and honestly, he wasn't wrong. But here's the thing about toxic family dynamics. They don't start at a 10. They start at a 2, maybe a 3, just uncomfortable enough that you notice, but not quite bad enough to cause a scene about. Then they gradually creep up over years, each incident slightly worse than the last, until one day you're standing in an airport hugging your traumatized son and realizing you've been watching this slow-motion train wreck for 7 years without doing enough to stop it. Looking back now, every holiday, every birthday party, Every family bonding event was carefully orchestrated to reinforce the hierarchy. Noah was at the bottom. We were somewhere in the disappointing middle, and Diane's family sat at the top, like royalty reviewing their subjects. I'd ignored the pattern because I wanted to believe that family meant something, that blood relations came with built-in decency and love. I convinced myself that maybe I was being too sensitive, that Margaret was just old-fashioned, that the favoritism wasn't as bad as it seemed. But abandoning a child at an airport? That's not a pattern you can ignore. That's the pattern finally showing you exactly what it's been building toward all along. About a month before the whole airport disaster that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of my life, Margaret called me on a Wednesday evening. Now, Margaret never called me directly. Usually, she'd communicate through Lydia like I was some kind of medieval peasant who wasn't worthy of direct contact with the Queen. So when I saw her name pop up on my caller ID, my first instinct was to let it go to voicemail and deal with whatever passive-aggressive message she left after I'd had a drink or three. But Lydia was standing right there doing dishes, and she gave me that look that wives give husbands when they know exactly who's calling and expect you to answer it like a responsible adult. "Ryan, darling," Margaret began, and let me tell you, when Margaret called anyone darling, it meant she wanted something. The woman had the emotional range of a parking meter. You put something in, you got something out, and there was zero warmth in the transaction. "I'm calling with the most wonderful news. Robert and I have decided to take all the grandchildren to Disney World for spring break. It'll be such a marvelous opportunity for family bonding and creating precious memories." My stomach immediately clenched because I knew exactly where this was going. Margaret's wonderful opportunities usually ended up costing me money, sanity, or both. "That sounds great," I said cautiously, trying to keep my tone neutral while my brain screamed warnings like a car alarm that nobody pays attention to. "Noah should definitely come along," she continued, and I could practically hear the smile in her voice. Not a warm, grandmotherly smile, but the kind of smile a shark makes right before it bites. "It will build character. You know how I feel about children experiencing new things and learning to be independent." There it was. That phrase again. Build character. In Margaret's vocabulary, building character was code for making children uncomfortable and calling it growth. I'd heard her use this phrase to justify everything from making Noah sleep on the floor during sleepovers at her house because the couch was for adults to forcing him to eat foods he was allergic to because pickiness is a choice, not a medical condition. Never mind that his pediatrician had explicitly said he had a legitimate shellfish allergy. Margaret was convinced it was just him being difficult. "I don't know, Margaret," I said, hedging because every instinct I had was screaming that this was a terrible idea. "Noah's pretty young for a trip like that without us. He's never been away from home for that long, and airports can be overwhelming for kids his age." "Nonsense," she cut me off with the authority of someone who believed her opinions were objective facts. "Chloe and Brandon have been traveling with us since they were practically infants. Children are far more resilient than parents give them credit for. Besides, Diane will be there, and she's marvelous with all the children." The emphasis on all the children was subtle but pointed, like she was implying that maybe if Noah spent more time with Diane and her perfect offspring, some of their superiority might rub off on him through osmosis or something. I should have said no right then. Should have trusted my gut, hung up the phone, and maybe started researching how to politely cut ties with toxic in-laws. But then Lydia walked over, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and whispered, "What's she saying?" And when I covered the phone and explained, Lydia's face lit up like I'd just told her she'd won the lottery. "Ryan, stop overthinking everything," Lydia said, loud enough that Margaret could definitely hear through the phone. "Mom's done this a million times with Diane's kids. This is good for Noah. He needs to learn to socialize more, be less clingy." The word clingy hit me wrong because Noah wasn't clingy. He was a normal 7-year-old who liked being around his parents. But in Lydia's family, any display of normal childhood attachment was viewed as weakness. Margaret jumped back in, sensing victory. "It's settled then. We'll handle all the planning. Now, obviously, we'll need you to contribute for Noah's expenses, just his share of the flights, Disney park tickets, meals, hotel accommodations, that sort of thing. We want this to be fair for everyone." The way she said fair made it clear that her definition of fairness was wildly different from what you'd find in any actual dictionary. Over the next week, the contributions kept adding up like some kind of sadistic math problem. First, it was $800 for the flight. Then another $1,000 for the Disney park passes because apparently they were doing the premium package with all the fast passes and character dining experiences. Then there were hotel costs, meal plans, souvenir budgets, and something called a travel emergency fund that Margaret insisted was necessary just in case. Every time I thought we'd reached the final number, Lydia would come to me with another Venmo request from her mother. "Babe, she needs another $200 for the character breakfast reservations," Lydia would say, showing me her phone like this was completely reasonable. "And $300 for the hotel upgrade because apparently the original rooms weren't suitable for children." "Weren't suitable?" I asked, my bank account weeping in the background. What does that even mean? Were they planning to put the kids in the maintenance closet? Lydia gave me that exasperated look that I'd become very familiar with over 7 years of marriage. "Don't be dramatic. Mom just wants to make sure everyone's comfortable. This is a once-in-a-lifetime experience for Noah." By the time all was said and done, I'd handed over $3,000. $3,000 that could have paid for several months of Noah's art classes that he loved, or finally fixed that weird noise our car was making, or gone into his college fund, or literally anything other than funding a trip where I had this growing, gnawing feeling in my gut that something was going to go horribly wrong. My coworker Marcus, who I'd mentioned this whole situation to during lunch one day, just stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "Let me get this straight," he said, setting down his sandwich. "You paid $3,000 to send your kid on vacation with people who actively dislike him? Man, that's like paying someone to insult you. Actually, it's worse. It's paying someone to insult your kid." "They don't dislike him," I defended weakly, but even I didn't believe the words coming out of my mouth. "They're just particular. And Lydia really wants Noah to bond with her family." Marcus shook his head. "Brother, I've met your in-laws exactly twice at your cookouts, and both times I felt like I needed a shower afterward. Those people have the warmth of a reptile house in winter." The morning they left for the airport, I took Noah aside while Lydia was loading his suitcase into Margaret's Mercedes SUV, because of course Margaret drove a Mercedes. Noah was wearing his favorite Captain America t-shirt and clutching his backpack like it contained the secrets to the universe. His eyes were wide with excitement and nervousness, that particular combination that kids get when they're about to do something new and aren't quite sure if they should be thrilled or terrified. "You're gonna have the best time, buddy," I told him, kneeling down to his eye level and fixing his collar that had gotten twisted. "Space Mountain, meeting Mickey Mouse, all the churros you can eat. It's gonna be epic." Noah hugged me tight, his little arms wrapping around my neck with that fierce strength that only children seem to possess. "I'll bring you back Mickey ears, Daddy," he whispered into my shoulder. "The cool ones with your name on them." I smiled, ruffling his hair and trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling settling in my chest like a stone. "Just bring yourself back, buddy. That's all I need. The Mickey ears are just a bonus." If I'd known what was coming, I would have grabbed Noah right then, thrown him in my car, and driven away from the Whitmore family forever. But hindsight's 2020, and at that moment, I still believed that family meant something to these people. I still believed they had a baseline level of human decency. I watched them drive away, Noah's little face pressed against the window waving at me, and I went back inside to a quiet house that felt emptier than it should have. 3 hours later, my phone buzzed with that message that would change everything. "Come get him. We're boarding now." And just like that, my $3,000 investment in family bonding became the most expensive lesson I'd ever learned about trusting the wrong people. The airport was absolute chaos, which I guess is pretty standard for any major transportation hub on a weekday afternoon. But when you're sprinting through it like your life depends on it, or more accurately, like your kid's emotional well-being depends on it, everything becomes this overwhelming sensory nightmare. There were people everywhere, dragging suitcases that seemed specifically designed to trip panicked fathers, families moving at the speed of continental drift while blocking entire walkways, and that constant drone of flight announcements that might as well have been in a foreign language for all the attention I was paying to them. I burst through the automatic doors of Terminal B like I was being chased by zombies, my shirt untucked, my tie hanging loose around my neck, probably looking like I'd just escaped from a business meeting that had gone terribly wrong. which, in a cosmic sense, I guess I had. The TSA agents at the security checkpoint looked up from their stations with that particular blend of boredom and suspicion that only government security personnel can truly master. One of them, a guy with a mustache that looked like it had its own zip code, stepped forward with his hand raised in that universal gesture of "Stop right there, buddy." "Sir, you need to calm down," he said in that tone that has never, in the entire history of human communication, actually helped anyone calm down. "What's the emergency?" "My kid," I gasped, because apparently running through a parking garage and most of a terminal had reminded my body that I hadn't been to the gym in approximately 4 years. My 7-year-old son was abandoned here. His grandmother and my wife just left him here alone. I got a text saying come get him, and then they boarded their flight. The words came tumbling out in a rush, and I could hear how insane it sounded even as I was saying it. Who abandons a child at an airport? What kind of people do that? The TSA agent's expression shifted from suspicious of possible threat to, "Oh, this is one of those calls faster than you could say family dysfunction." He grabbed his radio and mumbled something into it that I couldn't quite catch, then looked back at me with what might have been sympathy or might have been pity. Honestly, I would have taken either one at that point. "Airport police are with a child matching that description near gate C7, he said. "I'll escort you there. Follow me." We moved through the terminal at what felt like a glacial pace, even though we were walking pretty fast. Every second felt like an eternity. My mind kept conjuring up worse and worse scenarios. Noah crying alone. Noah scared that I wasn't coming. Noah thinking I'd abandoned him too. The guilt was crushing, even though logically I knew this wasn't my fault. I hadn't left him. I hadn't decided that teaching a 7-year-old a lesson was more important than basic human decency. But the voice in my head that loves to kick me when I'm down kept whispering that I should have seen this coming, should have protected him better, should have never let him go on this trip in the first place. Then I saw him, and I swear to God, my heart just stopped functioning like a normal organ. Noah was sitting on one of those uncomfortable airport benches that seemed designed to prevent anyone from being comfortable enough to fall asleep. On either side of him sat 2 police officers. One was an older black guy with gray in his beard and a nameplate that read Officer Daniels, and the other was a Korean woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun and an expression that suggested she'd seen some serious stuff in her career, but this still managed to surprise her. Her nameplate said Officer Kim, but it was Noah who destroyed me. His face was red and blotchy from crying, the kind of crying where you've been at it so long that your whole face just gives up and decides to match your emotions. His eyes were swollen and wet, and he was clutching his Captain America backpack against his chest like it was a life preserver, and he was drowning in an ocean of abandonment. His little shoulders were hunched up near his ears, making him look even smaller than his 7 years, and his legs were swinging nervously, not quite reaching the ground from the bench. "Daddy." The word came out like a sob and a gasp and a prayer all mixed together. And Noah launched himself off that bench with the kind of speed that only pure relief and terror combined can produce. He slammed into my legs. Then I scooped him up, and he wrapped himself around me like a koala bear, his face buried in my shoulder, his whole body shaking with the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep and primal. I held him, one hand on his back, the other cradling his head, and just let him cry while I whispered the things that parents say when their kids are hurt, and they wish they could absorb all the pain themselves. "I've got you, buddy. I'm here. You're safe. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." My own eyes were burning with tears I was trying really hard not to let fall because I felt like one of us needed to hold it together, and Noah had already paid his dues in the crying department. Officer Daniels stood up, and his face had this expression that I'd seen before on people who work with kids in bad situations. That mixture of professional composure and barely concealed anger at the adults who create those situations. "Mr. Morrison?" he asked, even though it was pretty obvious I was Noah's dad given the whole emotional reunion happening in front of him. "Yes," I managed to say, still holding Noah, who showed zero signs of letting go anytime soon. "I'm Ryan Morrison. This is my son, Noah. I got here as fast as I could." "What happened?" Officer Kim flipped open a notepad with the kind of practiced efficiency that told me she'd been doing this job for a while. "Your son was brought to our attention by a gate agent approximately 45 minutes ago," she said, her voice professional but with an edge of something harder underneath. He was found sitting alone at Gate B12, crying and saying his grandmother and mother had left him. When we investigated, we confirmed that Lydia Morrison and Margaret Whitmore had boarded Flight 2847 to Orlando without him. They were traveling with two other children, identified as Chloe and Brandon Whitmore, but left Noah behind. The way she said left Noah behind made it sound exactly like what it was, child abandonment. Not forgot him. Not accidentally got separated. Left him behind. Past tense. Deliberate action. Done deal. We've been trying to contact the family, Officer Daniels added, his jaw tight. The flight hadn't taken off yet when we first discovered Noah, but Ms. Morrison and Mrs. Whitmore refused to deplane. They insisted you would come get him and that this was, and I quote, a family matter that didn't concern airport security. I felt rage bubble up inside me like lava in a volcano that was about done with everyone's nonsense. They refused to get off the plane? I repeated, just to make sure I'd heard correctly, because surely I'd misunderstood. Surely even Margaret and Lydia wouldn't be that heartless. Yes, sir, Officer Kim confirmed. We spoke to them via the flight attendants. They maintained that they'd informed you via text message and that you'd agreed to pick him up. Is that accurate? Accurate. I let out a laugh that had absolutely zero humor in it. I got a text that said, come get him, we're boarding now, out of nowhere while I was at work. There was no discussion, no agreement, no warning. They just decided to abandon my son at the airport and told me to deal with it. Officer Daniels and Officer Kim exchanged a look that spoke volumes. Sir, Daniels said carefully, we're filing a report for child endangerment and abandonment. This is a serious matter. Your son is 7 years old and was left unattended in a major airport. That's not a lesson, that's a crime. Good, I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. File 10 reports. File 100. Whatever you need to do. My phone, which I'd forgotten was even in my pocket, started buzzing like an angry hornet. I pulled it out and saw the screen lighting up with calls and texts. Lydia, Margaret, even Diane was chiming in now. 17 missed calls. 32 unread messages. The notifications kept coming, each one probably more frantic than the last as they realized that maybe, just maybe, abandoning a child at an airport and expecting the father to just roll over and accept it wasn't going to fly. Pun absolutely intended. Officer Kim glanced at my phone, then back at my face. You want to answer those? She asked, and there might have been the tiniest hint of amusement in her otherwise professional demeanor. Nope, I said, feeling a savage satisfaction as I watched another call from Margaret come through and deliberately pressed the decline button. Let them panic at 30,000 feet. Let them wonder if I'm going to press charges. Let them sit in their first-class seats that they apparently upgraded themselves to while putting my son in economy, and let them think real hard about their life choices. Officer Daniels raised an eyebrow. They upgraded themselves? Oh yeah, I said, the pieces clicking together in my head. That's what this was about. They wanted to fly first class, probably didn't want to pay to upgrade all the kids, so they just decided Noah was expendable. The $3,000 I gave them for this trip? Apparently, it was just their upgrade fund. Officer Kim's expression hardened even further, which I didn't think was possible. We'll need you to come down to the station to give a full statement, she said. And we'll be contacting Orlando police to meet their flight when it lands. The image of Margaret and Lydia being greeted by police officers when they landed, right there in front of all the other passengers and Diane's perfect family, brought me more joy than it probably should have. But you know what? I was done feeling guilty about taking satisfaction in consequences finally catching up with terrible people. Whatever you need, I told the officers. Then I looked down at Noah, who'd finally stopped crying but was still holding on to me like I might disappear. Come on, buddy. Let's go home. The drive home from the airport was the quietest 45 minutes of my entire life, and not in a peaceful, comfortable silence kind of way. More like the silence after a bomb goes off and everyone's ears are still ringing, trying to process what just happened. Noah sat in the back seat, still clutching that Captain America backpack, staring out the window like he was watching a movie that only he could see. Every few minutes I'd glance in the rearview mirror to check on him, and every time I did, my heart would crack a little bit more. This was supposed to be his big Disney adventure, the trip he'd been excited about for weeks, talking about what rides he wanted to go on and which characters he wanted to meet. Instead, He got to experience what it felt like to be discarded like yesterday's newspaper. When we pulled into the driveway, Noah didn't immediately unbuckle his seatbelt like he usually did. He just sat there, frozen, until I opened his door and helped him out. He took my hand, something he hadn't done in about a year, because 7-year-olds are at that age where they're trying to be big kids, and held it so tight I could feel his pulse through his palm. We walked into the house together, and I had this weird moment of not knowing what to do next. Do I make dinner? Do we talk about what happened? Do I just let him decompress? Parenting books definitely don't have a chapter on what to do after your in-laws commit child abandonment. You hungry, bud? I asked, going for the safe, practical approach. We could order pizza. Extra cheese, just how you like it. Noah shook his head. Can I just go to my room? Yeah, of course, I said, trying to keep my voice normal even though everything felt completely abnormal. I'll be right downstairs if you need anything, okay? Anything at all. He nodded and headed up the stairs, still carrying that backpack, and I heard his bedroom door close softly. Not slam. Noah wasn't the door-slamming type, just close with this quiet finality that somehow felt worse than if he'd screamed and cried and thrown things. At least then I'd know what he was feeling. This quiet withdrawal scared me more than I wanted to admit. My phone, which I'd silenced during the drive home, was having an absolute meltdown in my pocket. When I finally pulled it out, I had 63 missed calls, 87 text messages, and somehow 5 voicemails, even though I thought voicemail was dead and nobody used it anymore. Apparently, when you're desperately trying to justify abandoning a child, you'll resurrect any form of communication technology available. The texts were a greatest hits compilation of manipulation, denial, and blame shifting. Lydia had sent approximately 30 messages, each one progressively more frantic and angry. The first few were attempts at damage control. Ryan, please answer your phone. We can explain. You're overreacting. Then they escalated to, I can't believe you called the police on my mother. Do you have any idea what you've done to this family? And finally devolved into, you're being completely unreasonable. We were trying to teach Noah independence, and you've turned it into some dramatic criminal case. Independence. The word made me want to throw my phone across the room. You don't teach a 7-year-old independence by abandoning them at an airport. You teach independence by letting them pour their own cereal or walk to a friend's house down the street, not by leaving them alone in a building full of strangers and potential danger. Margaret's messages were somehow even worse because they lacked any pretense of apology or self-reflection. Ryan, this is completely out of hand. Family doesn't call the police on family. We expected you to handle this with more maturity and understanding. You've embarrassed us in front of the entire airport staff and now the authorities. I hope you're proud of yourself. Every sentence was an accusation, a guilt trip, a twisted attempt to make me the villain in a story where they'd literally abandoned a child. Diane had gotten in on the action too, because of course she had. I don't know what Noah told you, but this is blown way out of proportion. Mom and Lydia made a parenting decision, and you've turned it into a federal case. My children are traumatized by all the police officers and questions. Thanks a lot. Right, because Chloe and Brandon being mildly inconvenienced by having to answer questions was totally the same as Noah being left alone at an airport. The lack of self-awareness was honestly impressive in its completeness. I stared at all these messages, feeling my blood pressure rising with each passing second, and then I did something that felt absolutely glorious in its simplicity. I blocked them. Every single one of them. Lydia, blocked. Margaret, blocked. Robert, who hadn't even bothered to reach out but would probably try eventually, blocked. Diane and her husband Trevor, blocked. I went through my contacts like I was playing whack-a-mole with toxic family members, and with each block, I felt a little bit lighter, like I was physically removing weight from my shoulders. The silence that followed was divine. No more buzzing, no more notifications, no more guilt trips disguised as text messages. Just blessed, peaceful quiet. Well, quiet except for the part of my brain that was spiraling with worry about Noah upstairs in his room, processing trauma that he shouldn't have to process at 7 years old. Around 7 that evening, my coworker Tessa showed up at my door carrying 3 large pizzas and a 6-pack of beer that looked expensive, the kind you buy when someone's having the worst day of their life and needs fancy alcohol to cope. Tessa was one of those rare coworkers who actually became a real friend. We'd started at the company around the same time, bonded over our shared hatred of Gerald's corporate jargon, and had maintained a friendship built on sarcasm, honest conversations, and mutual support through life's various disasters. "Heard you had a day," she said when I opened the door, holding up the pizzas like an offering to the gods of terrible family situations. "Gerald said you ran out of work like your ass was on fire, and when I texted to check on you, your response was just in-laws are sociopaths. So I figured pizza and emotional support were in order." I actually laughed for the first time since that morning, and it felt weird, like my face had forgotten how to make that expression. "Come in," I said, taking the pizzas. "You're not wrong about the sociopath thing. Turns out my in-laws abandoned Noah at the airport because they wanted to upgrade their seats to first class." Tessa stopped dead in the doorway. "I'm sorry, what?" "They did what now?" "Over pizza and beer, just one for me because I needed to stay alert in case Noah needed anything." I told her the whole story. The texts, the airport, the police, Noah's face when I found him, all of it. Tessa listened with the kind of focus that good friends have, not interrupting with platitudes or trying to fix things, just being present and bearing witness to the absolute insanity. "So let me get this straight," she said when I finished, gesturing with a slice of pepperoni. "You married into Satan's book club. They've been treating your kid like garbage for years. You paid them $3,000 to take him on vacation, and their idea of vacation was to ditch him at the airport and fly to Disney without him." "That's the summary." "Yeah," I confirmed, taking a long drink of beer that tasted like validation. "And your wife?" "Sorry, I know she's still your wife, but I'm about to say something harsh. Your wife just went along with it? She didn't say, 'Hey mom, maybe we shouldn't abandon my child at the airport'?" That was the part that hurt the most, honestly. I could accept that Margaret was a terrible person. I'd known that for years, even if I'd tried to pretend otherwise. But Lydia was Noah's mother. She was supposed to protect him, to put him first, to be the person who would never, ever let anything bad happen to him. Instead, she'd chosen her mother's approval over her son's well-being. She texted saying I was overreacting. I said quietly. Called me dramatic for involving the police. Tessa shook her head slowly. "Dude, that's not overreacting. That's called being a parent. You know what's dramatic? Abandoning a 7-year-old at an airport because you wanted to sit in the fancy seats with the free champagne." We sat in silence for a moment, and then Tessa asked the question I'd been avoiding thinking about. "So what happens now? Like, with your marriage?" "I have no idea," I admitted. "Right now, I just need to focus on Noah. He's upstairs in his room, hasn't eaten, barely talked. I'm calling his pediatrician tomorrow to get a referral for a child therapist because this kind of abandonment, that messes kids up." Tessa nodded. "Good call. And hey, for what it's worth, you did the right thing today. Calling the police, protecting your kid, all of it. Don't let them make you feel guilty for having basic human decency." After she left, I went upstairs to check on Noah. He was lying in bed, still wearing his shoes, staring at the ceiling. "Hey buddy," I said softly from the doorway. "Can I come in?" He nodded, and I sat on the edge of his bed. "I'm not going anywhere," I told him. "I'm right here, and I'm going to be right here every single day. You're safe." Noah's voice was small when he finally spoke. "Promise, promise," I said, and I meant it with everything I had. 3 months after the airport incident, I found myself sitting in a courtroom that smelled like old wood polish and broken dreams, watching my soon-to-be ex-wife and her mother perform what can only be described as an Oscar-worthy display of fake victimhood. The legal system moves slower than a DMV on a Monday morning, so it had taken this long to get to the actual criminal hearing for child endangerment and abandonment charges. In that time, Noah had started therapy twice a week with Dr. Patricia Chun, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma and had the patience of a saint. I'd also filed for divorce and full custody, because apparently abandoning your kid is one of those things that really puts a damper on marital bliss. The courtroom itself was exactly what you'd expect if you'd ever watched a legal drama on TV. Lots of dark wood, uncomfortable benches that seemed designed by medieval torture enthusiasts, and that weird acoustic situation where whispers somehow carried across the entire room, but when the judge spoke you had to strain to hear. I sat in the gallery behind the prosecutor's table, wearing the only suit I owned that didn't have coffee stains on it, trying to project an air of responsible father rather than man who's been stress-eating Oreos at 3 in the morning for 12 weeks. Margaret and Lydia sat at the defense table looking like they were attending a funeral for their reputations, which I guess in a way they were. Margaret had gone full Southern church lady for the occasion. A cream-colored dress suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, pearls that looked like they'd been personally harvested from the tears of orphans, and this expression of wounded dignity that suggested she was the real victim here. Lydia wore white, which was such an obvious choice that I almost laughed out loud. White for innocence, white for purity, white for please believe I'm not the kind of person who abandons children at airports. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, makeup subtle and tasteful, going for that devoted mother who made a tiny mistake aesthetic. Their lawyer, some guy named Richard Pemberton who looked like every corporate defense attorney in every movie ever made. Expensive suit, slick back hair, briefcase that probably cost more than my car, kept leaning over to whisper to them. Every few minutes Margaret would dab at her eyes with a lace handkerchief like she was in a Tennessee Williams play, even though I'd been watching her for 20 minutes and hadn't seen a single actual tear. Lydia kept her eyes down, playing the role of a shamed daughter supporting her maligned mother, or a shamed mother supporting her maligned mother, or just generally a shamed person who happened to be sitting in a courtroom because of her own terrible decisions. The prosecutor was a woman named Jennifer Matsuda, and she was exactly the kind of person you'd want on your side if your in-laws had committed a crime against your child. Late 30s, sharp as a tack, with this no-nonsense energy that suggested she had absolutely zero patience for entitled people who thought rules didn't apply to them. During our pretrial meetings, she'd listened to the whole story with increasing disbelief, at one point actually saying, they upgraded themselves to first class and left a 7-year-old alone. What kind of Disney villain bullshit is this? Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to me, though I wished we were related because she seemed cool, called the court to order, and everyone settled into that weird formal silence that courtrooms demand. Judge Morrison was an older black woman with gray hair, reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the kind of face that had probably seen every variation of human stupidity that the legal system had to offer. She looked at the paperwork in front of her, then at Margaret and Lydia, then back at the paperwork like she was double-checking that what she was reading was actually real. This court is now in session for the case of the state versus Margaret Whitmore and Lydia Morrison, charged with child endangerment and abandonment, she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of judicial authority that makes you sit up straight even if you're not the one in trouble. Ms. Matsuda, you may present the state's case. Jennifer stood up, smoothing her blazer, and addressed the jury with the kind of calm confidence that comes from knowing you have all the facts on your side. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about two adults who made a conscious decision to abandon a 7-year-old child at a major airport because they wanted to upgrade their airplane seats. Not because of an emergency, not because of confusion or miscommunication, but because they valued their own comfort more than a child's safety. She pulled out her phone. Well, not her actual phone, but an enlarged image of a phone screen projected onto a screen for the jury to see, and there they were. The text that had started this whole nightmare, blown up to 3 feet tall for everyone to read. Come get him. We're boarding now. Don't make us feel guilty. He needs to learn a lesson. You could actually hear the jury's collective intake of breath. One woman in the back row put her hand over her mouth. A guy in the front, middle-aged dad type, probably had kids of his own, shook his head and muttered something that I couldn't quite hear, but was probably not complimentary to the defendants. These messages, Jennifer continued, her voice sharp and clear, were sent to Ryan Morrison while he was at work, with no prior discussion, no agreement, and no warning. The defendants then boarded a flight to Orlando, Florida, leaving 7-year-old Noah Morrison alone in the airport terminal. When airport security contacted them before takeoff, they refused to deplane. They told security that this was a family matter and that the child's father would come get him. Margaret's lawyer shot up like someone had stuck him with a pin. Objection, Your Honor. This is inflammatory language designed to prejudice the jury against my clients. Judge Morrison looked at him over her glasses. Overruled. Ms. Matsuda is presenting facts supported by evidence. Continue, counselor. The next hour was a parade of witnesses that basically demolished any possible defense Margaret and Lydia might have had. Officer Daniels took the stand first, his uniform pressed and professional, and recounted finding Noah crying on the bench. In my 12 years as an airport police officer, he said, his voice steady, but with an undercurrent of anger, I have never encountered a situation where family members deliberately abandoned a child this way. We've had cases of children being accidentally separated from parents in crowded terminals, yes, but this was different. The child knew he'd been left behind. He told us his grandmother and mother had boarded without him. When we verified this with the gate agents and contacted the family on the aircraft, they confirmed they had left him and expressed no intention of returning. Officer Kim testified next, pulling out her detailed notes from that day. The defendant stated, and I quote, "We told his father to come get him. This is not a security matter. When I informed them that leaving a minor child unattended in an airport was indeed a security matter and a criminal matter, Mrs. Whitmore said, he's 7, not a baby. He'll survive an hour in the airport." Kim's expression when she read that quote suggested she'd like to have some choice words with Margaret that probably weren't appropriate for a courtroom setting. Then they called me to the stand, and I tried to keep my composure while recounting the worst day of my recent memory. Jennifer walked me through everything. The phone call from Margaret about the trip, the $3,000 I'd paid, the texts I'd received, the panicked drive to the airport, finding Noah traumatized and scared. When I described Noah's face when he saw me, his little body shaking as he cried, I had to pause and take a breath because my voice was starting to crack, and I'd promised myself I wouldn't cry in court. "Mr. Morrison," Jennifer asked gently, "in the months since this incident, how has Noah been?" "He has nightmares," I said, looking directly at Lydia, who wouldn't meet my eyes. "He sleeps with his shoes on because he's afraid someone will leave him somewhere and he won't be ready. He flinches when the doorbell rings. He's in therapy twice a week working through separation anxiety and trust issues. He's 7 years old, and he's afraid that people who are supposed to love him will abandon him when he becomes inconvenient." I saw one of the jurors, a younger woman, maybe late 20s, wipe her eyes. Margaret dabbed at her own eyes again with that stupid handkerchief, but I noticed her face was still completely dry. During cross-examination, Pemberton tried his best to make it seem like this was all some kind of misunderstanding, some blown-out-of-proportion family squabble that had gotten out of hand. "Mr. Morrison, isn't it true that you have a contentious relationship with your mother-in-law?" he asked, like that somehow justified child abandonment. "I have a contentious relationship with people who abandon children," I replied. "If that includes my mother-in-law, then yes." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, which Jennifer told me was remarkably fast and usually indicated a slam-dunk case. When they came back, the forewoman, the dad-type guy from the front row, stood up and read the verdict with the kind of conviction that suggested this decision had been easy. "We find the defendants guilty on all counts of child endangerment and abandonment." Margaret let out this theatrical sob that would have won her a Razzie Award for Worst Dramatic Performance. Lydia actually did cry this time, real tears streaming down her face, but I couldn't tell if she was crying from remorse or just from getting caught. Judge Morrison announced sentencing would be in 2 weeks, but laid out what they were facing: probation, mandatory parenting classes, community service, and a permanent no-contact order with Noah unless he explicitly requested contact when he was old enough to make that decision. As the bailiff led them out, Margaret turned to glare at me with pure venom in her eyes. "You're tearing this family apart," she hissed, loud enough for half the courtroom to hear. I smiled, couldn't help myself. "No, Margaret. You did that when you upgraded your seat and downgraded your humanity." About 3 weeks after the guilty verdict came down like the hammer of justice it was, I received a letter in the mail that made me laugh so hard I actually snorted coffee out of my nose, which hurt, but was somehow worth it. The envelope was fancy, like expensive cream-colored paper with embossed letterhead from Pemberton and Associates Legal Counsel. The kind of stationery that screams, "We charge $400 an hour to draft strongly worded letters." I opened it expecting maybe some formal notification about the sentencing or the no-contact order, but instead I got what can only be described as the most audacious piece of legal fiction I'd ever encountered outside of a John Grisham novel. The letter, written in that special brand of legalese that makes simple concepts sound like ancient prophecies, demanded that I return the full $3,000 I'd borrowed for Noah's trip. Borrowed. That was the actual word they used. as if I'd taken out a loan from the bank of narcissistic in-laws rather than paid for my son's portion of a family vacation that never happened because they abandoned him at the airport. The logic was truly spectacular in its complete disconnect from reality. Since the trip did not occur as planned due to unforeseen circumstances, and Master Noah Morrison did not participate in the arranged activities, the funds allocated for his participation should be returned to the parties who organized said trip. Unforeseen circumstances. They actually called deliberately abandoning a child at an airport unforeseen circumstances, like it was an act of God or a freak weather event rather than a conscious decision made by two adults who valued legroom over basic human decency. I read the letter 3 times, each read-through making me laugh harder than the last, until I was genuinely wheezing and Noah came downstairs to check if I was having some kind of medical emergency. "Dad, are you okay?" he asked, concerned in that way kids get when they see their parents losing it. "I'm perfect, buddy," I managed between gasps of laughter. "Your grandmother just sent me the funniest joke I've ever read. It's called Legal Consequences for My Own Actions." Noah didn't get it, obviously, because he was 7 and still believed the world operated on logical principles like fairness and cause and effect. But he smiled anyway because he could tell I was happy, and honestly, seeing him smile more frequently these days was worth every penny of legal fees, therapy costs, and emotional labor this whole situation was costing me. I called my lawyer immediately. Julia Grant was a divorce and family law attorney I'd hired about 2 weeks after the airport incident, when it became clear that my marriage was deader than disco and I needed someone who could navigate the legal complexities of extracting myself and Noah from the Whitmore family circus. Julia was in her mid-40s, wore power suits that could intimidate corporate executives, had a laugh like a whiskey-drinking sailor, and possessed the kind of take-no-prisoners attitude that made her perfect for dealing with people like Margaret and Lydia. "Julia, you're not going to believe this," I said when she picked up, not even bothering with hello because we'd moved past pleasantries about 6 phone calls ago. "Let me guess," she said, and I could hear her smirking through the phone. "Your ex-family wants something ridiculous and they sent it in writing? They want the $3,000 back," I told her, "for the trip that didn't happen, because they abandoned my kid at the airport." They actually used the phrase unforeseen circumstances to describe deliberately leaving a child alone in a public place. Julia's laugh exploded through the speaker so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "Oh, that's beautiful. That's absolutely beautiful. They just handed us a countersuit on a silver platter. Actually, scratch that, a gold platter. Are you free tomorrow? We need to file a response and a counterclaim so fast it'll make their heads spin." The next afternoon, I sat in Julia's office, which was decorated with law degrees, family photos, and a framed needlepoint that said, "Well-behaved women seldom make history," while she drafted what she described as the most satisfying legal document I've written all year. Her paralegal, a 20-something guy named Marcus who looked like he should be surfing in California instead of filing legal briefs in Ohio, kept peeking over her shoulder and grinning. "This is amazing," Marcus said at one point. "Can we frame this when it's done? We're not just asking for the $3,000 back," Julia explained to me, her fingers flying across her keyboard with the speed of someone who'd spent 20 years perfecting the art of legal warfare. "We're going to itemize every single expense you've incurred as a direct result of their actions. Noah's therapy sessions, that's $800 so far and counting. Your therapy sessions? Yes, you're going to therapy now too. We're adding that. Lost wages from the days you had to take off work to deal with this mess. Court costs. The expense of filing for divorce. Emotional damages. And we're going to ask for punitive damages on top of it all, because their behavior was so egregiously terrible that they need to be punished beyond just making you whole." "Is that actually legal?" I asked, because it sounded almost too good to be true. "Completely legal," Julia confirmed. "They're trying to sue you for money they spent on a trip where they committed a crime against your child. That's not just legally weak, it's legally stupid. Any judge with half a brain is going to see this for what it is: 2 people trying to avoid financial consequences for their criminal behavior. We're going to countersue, and we're going to win." 3 weeks later, we were back in court, this time in civil court for the monetary dispute. Judge Harrison presided, a middle-aged white guy with a receding hairline and the demeanor of someone who'd heard every ridiculous argument humanity could produce and was thoroughly unimpressed by all of them. Margaret and Lydia sat with Pemberton again, though I noticed their body language was different this time. Less confident, more defensive. Pemberton himself looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, probably because he knew he was arguing a losing case, and it was going to hurt his reputation more than help it. Julia stood up for our side, and I swear the temperature in the courtroom dropped about 10 degrees from the sheer cold professionalism she radiated. Your Honor, the plaintiffs are seeking reimbursement for funds they claim were misused when the planned trip did not occur. However, the trip did not occur because the plaintiffs abandoned the minor child at the airport and were subsequently convicted of criminal charges related to that abandonment. Essentially, they're asking to be reimbursed for funds they used to facilitate a crime. I watched the judge's eyebrows rise slightly, which Julia had told me was a good sign. Judges apparently had very controlled expressions, so any visible reaction meant you'd really made an impact. Pemberton tried to argue that the criminal case and the civil case were separate matters and should be evaluated independently. But even he sounded like he didn't believe what he was saying. Julia pounced on it like a cat on a laser pointer. Your Honor, how can we possibly evaluate these matters independently when one directly caused the other? She asked, her voice sweet as honey and sharp as a blade. My client paid $3,000 in good faith for his son to be safely escorted on a family vacation. Instead, the plaintiffs used a portion of those funds to upgrade their own seats and abandon the child. The money didn't go toward the child's benefit. It went toward the plaintiff's comfort while they were actively endangering that child. Then came my favorite part of the entire proceeding. Julia pulled out receipts, actual, physical receipts that she'd subpoenaed from the airline and Disney. Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit A, the flight manifest showing that Margaret Whitmore and Lydia Morrison upgraded their seats to first class at a cost of $1,200. Exhibit B, the original flight reservation showing that Noah Morrison's seat remained in economy. Exhibit C, receipts from the Disney resort showing that the plaintiffs booked a suite upgrade for themselves while maintaining a standard room for the children, including my client's son who they'd abandoned and who never made it to Florida. The judge actually leaned forward to look at the documents, his expression shifting from neutral to what I can only describe as deeply unimpressed with humanity. He looked at Margaret and Lydia like they were exhibits in a museum of bad decisions. So let me make sure I understand this correctly, Judge Harrison said, his voice carefully controlled in that way that meant he was probably screaming internally. Ms. Whitmore, Mrs. Morrison, you took money designated for a child's vacation, used it to upgrade your own accommodations, left that child at the airport, and are now seeking reimbursement because he didn't get to use accommodations you'd already downgraded and he couldn't access because you'd abandoned him? Pemberton opened his mouth, probably to say something about legal technicalities or procedural considerations, but the judge held up his hand. That was rhetorical, counselor. I've heard enough. He shuffled through some papers, made some notes, and then delivered the verdict that made the entire 3 months of legal hell worth it. The court finds in favor of the defendant, Ryan Morrison. Not only is the plaintiff's claim for reimbursement denied, but I'm awarding Mr. Morrison $5,000 in compensatory and punitive damages. The plaintiffs will also be responsible for all court costs and legal fees associated with this action. This court does not look favorably on individuals who commit crimes against children and then attempt to profit from those crimes through litigation. Margaret's face went through about 17 different shades of red and purple, like a mood ring having an existential crisis. Lydia looked like she might actually faint. Pemberton just closed his briefcase with the resigned air of a man who'd known this was coming and had already started drafting his withdrawal from their case. When the check arrived 2 weeks later, after some back and forth with their accounts and probably some teeth pulling from Julia's office, I sat at my kitchen table with Noah and showed it to him. $5,000. More than I'd originally paid, enough to cover his therapy for months, enough to actually take him on that Disney trip he'd been promised and deserved. Buddy, I said, watching his face as he looked at the check with the kind of awe that 7-year-olds reserve for really big numbers. This money was supposed to be for your Disney trip originally. And you know what? We're going to use it for exactly that. You and me, we're going to Disney World, and this time we're doing it right. Noah's eyes went so wide I thought they might fall out of his head. Really? We're really going. We're really going, I confirmed, grinning at his excitement. And buddy, we're flying first class. The real kind, not grandma's kind. The kind where they actually want you there. His laugh was the best sound I'd heard in months, pure and joyful, and completely untainted by the trauma he'd experienced. We high-fived across the table, and I made a mental note to thank Julia with the biggest fruit basket the legal profession had ever seen. Karma, it turns out, doesn't just walk. Sometimes it flies first class. Planning a Disney trip as a single dad, trying to make up for your kid's trauma, while also proving that you're not completely incompetent at this whole parenting thing, turns out to be way more complicated than those cheerful Disney commercials make it look. I spent approximately 47 hours researching the best hotels, the optimal park strategy, which fast passes to book, what restaurants had the best character dining experiences, and whether the Bibbidi Bobbidi Boutique was just for girls or if boys could get makeovers too. Spoiler alert, it's mostly for girls, but they'll do whatever makes kids happy, which is honestly the kind of inclusive capitalism I can get behind. I booked us a room at the Grand Floridian, not because I'm fancy or because I suddenly came into money, but because after everything Noah had been through, I wanted him to feel special, valued, and like he mattered enough for the nice place with the giant gingerbread house in the lobby. Also, and I'll admit this was petty, I really enjoyed the irony of using Margaret's court-ordered payment to book a resort that was nicer than wherever she'd planned to stay. Sometimes revenge is a dish best served with Mickey-shaped waffles and a monorail view. The flight down was Noah's first time in first class, and watching his face when we boarded was worth every penny of the upgrade. His eyes went wide when he saw the actual legroom. Like, adult human being legroom, not contortionist training legroom. And the flight attendant, a cheerful woman named Sandra who had clearly been doing this job long enough to spot a kid who needed extra kindness, brought him apple juice in an actual glass cup, and treated him like a tiny business executive. "Mr. Morrison," she said to Noah with complete seriousness, "would you prefer the chicken or the pasta for your in-flight meal?" Noah looked at me with this expression of pure wonder, like he'd just discovered that airplanes could serve real food instead of those sad little bags of pretzels that taste like cardboard's disappointing cousin. "They have real food," he whispered. "They have real food, buddy," I confirmed. "Pick whatever you want." He ordered the pasta, ate every bite, and spent the rest of the flight alternating between watching a movie on the personal TV screen and telling me facts about airplanes that he was clearly making up, but I wasn't about to correct because his enthusiasm was too precious. "Did you know that planes can fly backwards if the pilot is really good?" "No, Noah, that's not how aerodynamics works, but I love your confidence." Disney World itself was exactly the kind of overwhelming sensory chaos that you expect when you combine Florida heat, thousands of tourists, and every licensed character that the Walt Disney Company has ever acquired through either creation or corporate merger. We hit Magic Kingdom first because that's where Space Mountain lived, and Noah had been talking about Space Mountain like it was his personal white whale ever since I'd promised we were going. The first ride through, he gripped my hand so tight I lost circulation in 3 fingers, screaming his head off in that way where you can't tell if it's terror or joy or some combination of both. When we got off, his hair was sticking up in 17 different directions, his eyes were huge, and he was grinning like someone had just told him Christmas was happening twice this year. Again, he demanded. Not asked. Demanded. And who was I to deny him? We rode Space Mountain 5 times that first day. By the 3rd run, Noah had his hands up the whole time. By the 5th, he was trying to spot where the ride went based on the brief flashes of light in the darkness. Other kids were crying to get off. My kid was negotiating for extended sessions. That's my boy. Somewhere around day 3, after we'd conquered every major ride at least twice, consumed approximately our body weight in Dole Whip and Mickey-shaped ice cream bars, and Noah had acquired a Goofy hat that he absolutely refused to take off even when we went back to the hotel. We found ourselves on our room's balcony watching the fireworks over Cinderella's castle. The Florida night was warm and humid in that way that makes your shirt stick to your back, and somewhere in the distance, you could hear, "When You Wish Upon a Star," playing through the park speakers because Disney is nothing if not committed to their brand. Noah was standing at the railing, still wearing that ridiculous Goofy hat, holding a Mickey-shaped pretzel that cost approximately $8 and was worth every cent because it made him happy. He turned to me with this expression that was way too serious for a 7-year-old at Disney World. "Daddy," he said quietly, This is way better than it would have been with Mommy's family. My heart did this weird squeeze thing that parents' hearts do when their kids say something profound without realizing how profound it is. I knelt down next to him, so we were eye level, putting my arm around his shoulders. Yeah, buddy. Why's that? He thought about it for a moment, watching the fireworks burst across the sky in blues and purples and golds. Because we actually like each other, he said simply. Grandma Margaret always looked at me like I was doing something wrong even when I was just sitting there. And Chloe and Brandon never wanted to play with me. But you actually want to be here with me. I had to take a second because my eyes were getting suspiciously wet, and I'd promised myself I wouldn't cry during this trip except maybe during the really emotional parts of the fireworks show, because that's allowed. Noah, listen to me. I don't just want to be here with you. There's literally nowhere else in the entire world I'd rather be. You're my favorite person, and spending time with you is my favorite thing. Got it? He nodded, leaning into me, and we watched the rest of the fireworks in comfortable silence. This right here, this moment of peace and happiness and security, was what therapy looked like when you disguised it as vacation. Every Mickey hug, every ice cream cone, every screaming laugh on a roller coaster was slowly rebuilding the trust that Margaret and Lydia had shattered. Dr. Chun had told me that healing from abandonment trauma wasn't about one big breakthrough moment. It was about consistent, repeated experiences of safety and love until the kid's brain finally accepted that they weren't going to be left behind again. So we made as many moments as we could. We met every character Noah wanted to meet, even the obscure ones from movies I'd never heard of. We ate at restaurants where characters came to your table. Noah's favorite was the Chef Mickey's breakfast where Goofy signed his hat and Mickey gave him a high five that he talked about for the rest of the day. We bought stupid, overpriced souvenirs that we absolutely didn't need, but would become precious memories. A lightsaber from Galaxy's Edge, a pirate sword from Adventureland, approximately 17 pins for his new pin trading hobby that I didn't know existed until 3 days ago. One afternoon, while Noah was in the hotel pool doing cannonballs and yelling, "Watch this, Dad," every 30 seconds like I might have stopped watching in the previous 29 seconds, I posted a single photo to my Facebook account. It was a picture of us in front of Cinderella's castle, both of us holding those Mickey-shaped ice cream bars, Noah's goofy hat slightly askew, both of us grinning like idiots. The caption was simple. Sometimes the best family is just you and your kid holding Mickey bars. I didn't tag anyone. Didn't make it a pointed statement about the Whitmores. Didn't need to explain the context to anyone who mattered because the people who knew. It was just a dad and his son having the time of their lives, and that was enough. Of course, Margaret couldn't help herself. About 2 hours after I posted that photo, she put up some vague Facebook status about betrayal and ingratitude and people who turn their backs on family over misunderstandings. Her exact words were something like, "It's heartbreaking when you try to teach someone a valuable lesson and they respond with vindictiveness. Some people will never understand that family means forgiveness, not revenge. Praying for those who have lost their way." The post had about 47 comments from her church friends who had no idea what she was talking about, but were happy to offer prayers and support for whatever imaginary persecution she was experiencing. I saw it because my mom, who was still friends with Margaret on Facebook and sent me screenshots with messages like, "Can you believe this woman?" forwarded it to me. I read it once, felt absolutely nothing except maybe mild amusement, and went back to watching Noah attempt to do a backflip into the pool. Margaret's desperate attempt to paint herself as the victim in a story where she'd literally abandoned a child was just background noise now. Static from a radio station I'd stopped listening to months ago. "Dad, did you see that one?" Noah called from the pool, water dripping from his hair. "I saw it, buddy. That was awesome." I called back, putting my phone away. And it really was awesome. All of it. The rides, the shows, the overpriced turkey legs that were somehow still delicious, the pins, the parades, the moments where Noah would just randomly hug me and say this is the best day ever for the 7th time that week. By the time we flew home, first class again, because we'd started this trip with dignity and we'd end it that way too. Noah had transformed from the scared, withdrawn kid I'd picked up at the airport 3 months ago into something closer to his old self. Still healing, still in therapy, still sleeping with his shoes on occasionally, but laughing more, trusting more, living more. The best part? When we got home and he unpacked his suitcase, he carefully arranged all his Disney souvenirs on his bookshelf. The Mickey ears with his name on them, the Goofy hat, the pins, the lightsaber, everything. Right in the middle, he put a photo we'd gotten from one of those Disney PhotoPass photographers. The two of us on Splash Mountain, both screaming our heads off right before the big drop, pure joy frozen in time. "This is my favorite picture ever," he told me. "Mine too, kid. Mine too." 6 months after the Disney trip, life had settled into a comfortable rhythm that I'd never thought possible during those first dark weeks after the airport incident. Noah was thriving in a way that made Dr. Chin smile during our monthly check-ins. We'd scaled back from twice-weekly sessions to once a month because he was doing so well. He'd made new friends at school, joined the art club where he was apparently creating masterpieces with finger paints and enthusiasm, and had recently informed me that he wanted to be either an astronaut or a professional pizza taste tester when he grew up. Both seemed like solid career choices with equal amounts of gravitational challenges. The divorce from Lydia had been finalized about 2 months prior, and I'd gotten full custody of Noah with 0 visitation rights for her unless Noah explicitly requested it, and a judge agreed, which seemed about as likely as Margaret developing self-awareness. Lydia had moved back in with her parents, because of course she had, and as far as I knew, they were all living together in that big house of judgment and passive aggression, probably sitting around the dinner table discussing how I'd ruined their lives by having the audacity to report their crimes. I'd gotten used to the peace. The absence of Sunday dinners where I had to watch my kid be ignored. The freedom from family group chats full of thinly veiled insults disguised as helpful suggestions. The relief of not having to defend basic parenting decisions against people who thought abandonment was a teaching tool. Life was good. Life was stable. Life was exactly what Noah needed. So naturally, the universe decided it was time to test that stability in the most mundane way possible, a grocery store encounter on a random Tuesday evening. Noah and I were doing our weekly shopping at the Kroger on Hamilton Avenue, the one with the good bakery section and the slightly judgmental cashier who always commented on my frozen pizza purchases like she was personally offended by my cooking choices. We had our system down. Noah would push the cart while I grabbed items, and every third aisle I'd let him pick one thing he wanted, which is how we'd ended up with a collection of increasingly bizarre cereal flavors and something called Mega Sour Blast gummies that I was pretty sure violated several Geneva Convention rules about chemical warfare. We were in the produce section, having a serious debate about whether bananas should be slightly green or fully yellow. Noah was team green. I was team yellow. We were at an impasse when I heard it. That voice. The one that had haunted my nightmares and fueled my therapy sessions for months. Margaret's voice, carrying across the produce section with the volume of someone who wanted to be overheard but would deny it if confronted. "Some people just hold grudges forever," she said loudly, presumably to whoever was with her. "Can't let bygones be bygones. Have to drag everything through the courts and make a spectacle of private family matters." I looked up, and there they were. Margaret and Lydia, standing about 20 feet away near the organic lettuce that cost approximately the same as a small car payment. Both of them frozen like deer in headlights when they realized I'd spotted them. Lydia was wearing sunglasses. Inside, in a grocery store, at 7 p.m. when the sun had already set. The sunglasses were huge, covering half her face, the kind that celebrities wear when they're trying to avoid paparazzi or hiding evidence of bad decisions. I guess shame has an SPF rating now. Margaret recovered first, pulling herself up to her full height and adopting that expression of wounded dignity that she wore like armor. She was dressed like she was going to a country club brunch rather than shopping for groceries. A designer blazer that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget, pearls that I'm pretty sure she slept in, and shoes with heels that clicked on the linoleum floor like tiny hammers of judgment. I felt Noah tense beside me, his hand gripping the shopping cart handle a little tighter. This was it, the moment Dr. Chun had prepared us for. The inevitable encounter with his trauma sources in an uncontrolled environment. We'd role-played different scenarios in therapy. What if you see them at a restaurant? What if you run into them at the mall? What if they try to talk to you? Noah had practiced responses, practiced staying calm, practiced remembering that he was safe and they couldn't hurt him anymore. But theory and practice are two very different things when you're 7 years old and facing the people who abandoned you at an airport. Dad, Noah said quietly, his voice steady but uncertain. Can we go? The bananas here are weird. The bananas here are weird. It was the most gloriously perfect excuse I'd ever heard. Completely nonsensical given that bananas are pretty standardized across grocery stores, but also the kind of kid logic that was impossible to argue with. I wanted to high-five him for the quick thinking, but instead I just nodded. Yeah, buddy, you're absolutely right. These bananas are super weird. Let's try the other side of the store. We turned to leave, and I thought that might be it. A clean exit, no confrontation, no drama. But Margaret, being Margaret, couldn't let it go. She had to get the last word in, had to make sure we knew she was the victim in this story she'd written in her head. It's such a shame, she said, even louder now, her voice practically echoing through the produce section. When children are turned against their own family, poisoned by bitterness and lies. But I suppose some people need someone to blame for their own failures. I stopped walking. Every instinct I had was screaming to just keep moving, to not engage, to be the bigger person, and all those other phrases that people use when they mean, let terrible people say terrible things without consequences. But I was so tired. Tired of her victim complex. Tired of her rewriting history. Tired of her acting like she hadn't committed an actual crime that she'd been convicted of in an actual court of law. I turned around, keeping one hand on the shopping cart where Noah stood, and looked Margaret directly in the eyes. You're right, Margaret. It is a shame when children can't trust their family, especially when that family abandons them at airports to upgrade their plane seats. Real shame. Tragic, even. Her face went through several shades of red, like a traffic light having an identity crisis. Lydia grabbed her arm, whispered something I couldn't hear, and tried to steer her away. But Margaret wasn't done, because Margaret was never done. You had no right to involve the authorities in a family matter, she hissed. No right to humiliate us like that. We were trying to teach him independence, and you twisted it into something. You left a 7-year-old alone at an airport. I interrupted, my voice calm but firm. That's not teaching independence. That's child abandonment. The court agreed. The jury agreed. The only person who doesn't agree is you. And frankly, your opinion stopped matching the moment you sent that text. Lydia was pulling harder on Margaret's arm now, and I could see people starting to stare. An elderly couple by the tomatoes had stopped their shopping to watch the drama unfold like it was a particularly entertaining episode of reality TV. A store employee with a name tag that said Kevin was hovering nearby with his hand on his radio, probably trying to decide if this situation required manager intervention. I looked down at Noah, expecting to see fear or anxiety or that withdrawn expression he used to get whenever the Whitmores were mentioned. But instead, he just looked calm. Maybe a little sad, but not scared. Not traumatized. Just a kid who'd seen some adults behaving badly and decided they weren't worth his energy. Dad, he said again, tugging on my shirt. Can we really go now? I want to make cookies tonight, and we need chocolate chips. The simplicity of it, the way he'd reduced this whole confrontation to an obstacle between him and cookie ingredients, was so perfect that I almost laughed. This was growth. This was healing. This was a kid who'd been through hell and come out the other side knowing his own worth. Absolutely, buddy. Chocolate chips it is. We walked away, leaving Margaret sputtering and Lydia hiding behind her ridiculous sunglasses. As we turned the corner into the baking aisle, Noah looked up at me with this expression of wisdom that 7-year-olds shouldn't have, but sometimes do. I'm not scared of them anymore, Dad, he said matter-of-factly. I just feel kind of bad for them. Out of the mouths of babes, right? I stopped the cart and knelt down to his level. Bad for them? Why's that? He shrugged, picking up a bag of chocolate chips and examining it like it held the secrets to the universe. Because they're so angry all the time. They can't just be happy. Grandma always has to be mad at somebody. That seems really tired. That seems really tired. I wanted to write that phrase down and send it to Dr. Chun because it was the most insightful psychological analysis of Margaret Whitmore I'd ever heard. The kid had nailed it. Being perpetually angry, perpetually the victim, perpetually unable to accept responsibility was exhausting. And Noah, at 7 years old, had recognized that their misery was self-inflicted and not his responsibility to fix. We grabbed our chocolate chips. The good kind with the extra chocolate, because we deserved it, and finished our shopping without further incident. Kevin, the store employee, gave us a thumbs up as we passed, and the elderly couple by the tomatoes smiled at Noah like he was a tiny hero who'd just defeated a dragon. which in a way, he had. That night, we stood in our kitchen baking chocolate chip cookies from scratch, flour everywhere, chocolate chips being eaten at a ratio of approximately 3 chips in the dough to 1 chip in our mouths. Noah stood on his step stool at the counter, mixing the batter with intense concentration, and I watched him with this overwhelming sense of gratitude for how far we'd come. "Dad," he said, not looking up from his mixing, "can we call tonight the Great Banana Escape?" I laughed, ruffling his flour-dusted hair. "The Great Banana Escape it is, buddy. We'll add it to our list of adventures. Right up there with Disney, and that time we saw the really fat raccoon in the backyard." Exactly like that. All the important historical events. We finished our cookies, ate way too many while they were still warm, and spent the rest of the evening on the couch watching some animated movie about talking cars or talking planes or talking something. Honestly, they all kind of blend together after a while. But Noah was happy, relaxed, curled up next to me with cookie crumbs on his shirt and that sense of security that every kid deserves. Therapy achieved, not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but through chocolate chips and bad grocery store encounters and the simple knowledge that some people's drama wasn't our problem anymore. 2 years later, life looked nothing like I'd imagined it would back when I was married to Lydia and pretending that her family's toxicity was just quirky instead of criminal. Noah was 9 now, thriving in ways that made my chest tight with pride every time I thought about it. He was pulling straight A's in school. Except for handwriting, which looked like a drunk spider had learned cursive, but we were working on it. He'd become this budding artist who covered our fridge with drawings of superheroes, spaceships, and occasionally disturbing stick figure scenarios that his art teacher called emotionally expressive, and I called potentially concerning, but probably fine. He'd also appointed himself the official pancake flipper of our household, a title he took incredibly seriously, complete with a chef's hat he'd insisted I buy him from Target. I'd grown too, though probably not in the ways that self-help books and motivational Instagram accounts would define as growth. I was calmer, sure, but mainly because I'd cut out the primary sources of stress in my life like a surgeon removing tumors. I was happier, definitely, because turns out not being married to someone who enables child abandonment really improves your overall life satisfaction. And I'd gotten significantly better at dad jokes, which Noah claimed was actually getting worse, but I chose to interpret his groaning as deep appreciation for my comedic genius. We developed our own traditions, Noah and me, little rituals that were ours alone, untainted by the Whitmore family's special brand of dysfunction. Movie nights every Friday where we'd argue about whether we were watching his pick or mine. And somehow we always ended up watching his pick, because I'm a pushover and he knows it. Sunday morning pancake competitions where we'd rate each other's creations on presentation, taste, and structural integrity, which was just a fancy way of saying whether they fell apart when you tried to cut them. And my personal favorite, New Year's Eve on the front porch with hot chocolate and fireworks. This particular New Year's Eve was cold enough that we could see our breath, but we bundled up in blankets and winter coats, sitting on our porch swing with mugs of hot chocolate loaded with enough marshmallows to constitute a fire hazard. The neighborhood was already getting loud with people setting off fireworks early because apparently waiting until midnight was for people with patience and respect for local noise ordinances. Noah was wearing his goofy hat from Disney. Yes, still, 2 years later, and holding his hot chocolate like it was precious cargo. We sat there in comfortable silence for a while, watching Mrs. Patterson across the street struggle with a sparkler that wouldn't light while her husband offered completely unhelpful advice from their porch. Then Noah asked one of those questions that kids ask sometimes, the ones that seem simple on the surface but are actually loaded with all kinds of emotional weight. "Dad, if you could go back and change it, would you?" I knew exactly what it meant. The airport, the abandonment, the divorce, the whole traumatic situation that had fundamentally altered the course of our lives. I took a sip of hot chocolate, giving myself a second to think about how to answer honestly without being heavy-handed about it. "Only the part where I let your grandma near a boarding gate," I said, and Noah laughed. This genuine, full laugh that made his hot chocolate slosh dangerously close to the edge of his mug. But then I got serious, because he deserved a real answer, not just a joke. "Honestly, buddy, no, I wouldn't change it. Because look at us now. We're stronger. We're happier. We're free from all that fake family stuff where people pretended to care but didn't really. We know who we are now. We know what we're worth. And we know that family isn't just about blood. It's about people who actually show up for you. Noah nodded slowly, processing this with the kind of thoughtfulness that always surprised me. We make a good team, he said simply. The best, I confirmed, and we clinked our mugs together like we were toasting with champagne instead of hot chocolate. Right on cue, the sky exploded with fireworks from the park down the street, the official city display that they put on every year, all sparkly and patriotic and excessive in that very American way. Blues and reds and golds burst across the darkness, reflecting in Noah's eyes as he watched with the same wonder he'd had when he was 5. Some things don't change, and honestly, I hoped his capacity for wonder never would. Somewhere out there, probably in that big house on the nice side of town, Margaret and Lydia and the rest of the Whitmore clan were likely sitting around their dinner table, still bitter, still angry, still convinced they were the victims in a story where they'd abandoned a child. Maybe they were blaming me for ruining their perfect family image. Maybe they were telling themselves that they'd done nothing wrong and the courts were biased, and I'd poisoned Noah against them. Maybe they'd convinced themselves of an entirely different version of reality where they were the heroes. But honestly, I didn't care. Not even a little bit. Their narrative wasn't my problem anymore. Me? I was too busy building a life where my son would never again have to wonder if he mattered. A life where love wasn't conditional on good behavior or quiet compliance or fitting into someone else's hierarchy. A life where family meant safety and laughter and chocolate chip cookies and bad movies and porch swings and hot chocolate and the absolute certainty that we had each other's backs, no matter what. Noah leaned against my shoulder as the fireworks continued their show, and I wrapped my arm around him, feeling the weight of him, solid, real, here, safe. And that, my friends, is how a $3,000 disaster turned into the best investment of my life. Not because of the money I eventually got back, though that was a nice bonus, but because it forced me to choose my kid over toxic people who shared his DNA. It forced me to draw boundaries I should have drawn years ago. It forced me to build something better from the ashes of something broken. Happy New Year, buddy, I said as midnight approached. Happy New Year, Dad, Noah replied. This year's gonna be even better. And you know what? I believed him.